Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. This is episode 132, and we're joined by a repeat guest. His name is Dr. Marc James Léger, and he's based in Montreal, Canada. And Dr. Léger got his PhD in Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester. And his book catalog is pretty extensive, but I want to highlight three books especially. I'm going to link all of his books in the episode description of this episode 132. He previously came on the show, episode 118. I recommend my audience to go back and watch that episode 118. We discussed the Obama portraits, and we discussed a little bit of this book that we're really going to delve into today, entitled Bernie Bros Gone Woke, Class, Identity, Neoliberalism. And then the other two books that we will not discuss today, but the first episode 118, we really went into detail with Too Black to Fail, the Obama portraits and the politics of post-representation. And we went over a lot of the slideshows, some of the portraits, interpreted some of the images. So that's a worthwhile episode, again, episode 118. And then another book that Dr. Léger published is Identity Trumps Socialism, the Class and Identity Debate After Neoliberalism. And this is his newest book. I believe that is because he's published so much, I've kind of lost track. But my audience, I know, is super excited to hear you on this episode 132. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting things today. But I just want to say welcome back to the show, and thanks for accepting that invitation.
Thanks very much, Kiko. I'm happy to be on your show. I really appreciated the last interview we did. It was really nice for me to present that material, because the book Too Black to Fail is a print on demand. So you're not, and it's published by a small publisher at the university, at Carleton University in Ottawa. So you're not going to find it in a bookstore. It's not going to be advertised on a lot of the usual sort of Amazon type book sites. It's probably on Amazon, but not so many of the others. So it's not the kind of thing that's going to, come across your path sort of serendipitously. So, it helps for me to let people know that work exists. And as far as I'm aware, there aren't any critiques of this material. So, I'm happy to have that episode. And again, to be on your show to talk about a different project. The Obama book was published after the Sanders book, but the Sanders book was accepted by a publisher first. And it created a bit of a conflict, because since this book is coming out, I didn't want to repeat myself in terms of the things that I had said in the Obama book. But some of the things were shifted from one book to the other. It created a bit more of a balance in terms of page numbers. So it makes each book a little bit less daunting, and similar issues, but of course with a completely different politician and a different campaign. So it's interesting because both of them allow me to talk about class and identity, but in a different political space. So I'm happy to be on. But there's something we didn't discuss before we started recording. The last time I did an interview, I did it pro bono. But this second time, I'm going to be charging you Michelle Obama rates. So that's going to be $750,000 for the first hour. And if we go over, maybe it doesn't matter that much.
That's hilarious. Michelle Obama rates. Is that joke? Is there any validity to that joke? As far as, does she charge a certain amount of money?
Yeah, she's charged exactly that amount of money for a 1-hour lecture somewhere in Europe, almost $1 million an hour.
Wow.
But it's worthwhile because she can have your enemies killed. So in the end, it pays off.
That is powerful. But that is absolutely revealing too, because I thought it was just a joke, but you were serious. I mean, these people really do this type of stuff. And then on top of that, it makes me think of all the campaign contributions that are pretty much infinite now. There's no sort of limit to what the two parties can spend. They have all these loopholes as far as who can send them donations, and it really tells you a lot about the political system. That's
George,
$750,000 for a lecture.
Yeah. George W. Bush came to Montreal a few years ago. I forget when it was. It was after his term was over, to give a lecture. And it was sort of like the Chamber of Commerce, business people sponsoring him. And it would have to be business people, because it has to be somebody who can afford to bring him in. And I think he was charging something like $50,000 an hour, something like that. But I went there with a group of people to throw our shoe at the hotel where he was giving his talk, in memory of the journalist, the Middle Eastern journalist who had thrown his shoe at him that one time.
Gosh, I've never seen reflexes that quick. Nah, that was a moment in history. But
actually, Trump has quicker reflexes, it seems.
Oh no! Wow.
He missed that bullet by, I don't know,
God.
I would say half an inch.
Oh gosh! Wow. This is already starting out fun, but I tell you, there's a lot to discuss, and we're going to get into it. Slight ad before we get started. We have pretty much an even split in audiences. 46% of the people who follow the show are located outside of the United States. And then we have another 54% domestic listener viewership. And I just want to say, subscribe for free on Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. Tell your friends and family to share all the information, content. There's something for everyone here. We're going to offer free Spanish lessons within the upcoming weeks, months. Just a way to kind of provide a service to people. It'll probably generate more interest in the show, because everyone doesn't want to watch the political shows, but we're not strictly a political show. We're a cultural show too. And we believe that there's something for everyone here to learn. So if you have an open mind, you want to take a little bit of your time to expand your mind without spending a dime, this may be the show for you, Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. So tell all your friends and family to subscribe for free. Remember, you can't unthink free thought. My first question for you, and you have so much to discuss in this Bernie Bros Gone Woke. What went into the title? First of all, especially the Gone Woke part. Like, can you kind of tease the audience and tell us what went into your thought process with the title?
I don't know how I came up with it. I know that when I came up with Too Black to Fail, that was kind of easy, because too big to jail and too big to fail, the banks and the torture. So that one was kind of easy. But when I came up with it, it sort of seemed nasty, Too Black to Fail. And I thought, yeah, it should be nasty, because we're dealing with difficult, horrible topics, And so, a title that can get your attention is helpful sometimes. My new book is called Class Struggle and Identity Politics, subtitle, A Guide. It's not this is a Routledge publication, and it's intended as a pedagogical tool. It's intended as a course reader for undergraduate and graduate courses, and it walks you through various topics. So in a way, the title is fine, but it was the publisher's decision to have that title. I had something that was a little bit more catchy. And Bernie Bros Gone Woke, it's just a title I came up with. The publisher was fine with it. So, there were no issues. Susan Nyman, scholar who specializes on the Enlightenment, wrote a book called Left is Not Woke. And she's talked about how people said to her, maybe you shouldn't have used the word woke, because when the term started being used in the last, I don't know, something like 4 years, something like that, people were using woke in the sense of cancel culture, social justice warrior excess, these kinds of things. And then it came out that woke had been used in the African American community in this phrase, stay woke, in the sense of be alert to, forms of discrimination. And that, I don't know how far back it goes, but it goes back like many years. So, when I encountered the term woke, I didn't know it had this backstory. I didn't know it had, this meaning of, be alert to discrimination. And so she was told, it was suggested to her that she shouldn't have used that term, but she disagrees. She thinks that, no, that's exactly the term, because it's like a buzzword. And this is what people are debating, and this is what people are disagreeing about. And so why avoid it? It's kind of like when queer theorists reclaimed the term queer, that had been a derogatory term, and so, gave it a new sense. It's similar to that, except that it's the opposite of reclaiming. It's more sort of unpacking or problematizing. It's saying, here's this term that's a buzz term, and that's what this is about. All of these issues that are tied to this word cloud. These are the things that I want to talk about. And so Bernie Bros is a meme, right? It was invented by the Hillary Clinton campaign. The first person to use it, I think, was in an article in The Atlantic. And this person was not affiliated with the campaign, but the campaign used that term, Bernie Bros. And this was in 2016. Early on in the campaign, Bernie was saying things that you shouldn't vote for a candidate on the basis of their identity, i.e. Hillary Clinton. You should vote for a candidate on the basis of their platform, their agenda, their program, and their history of policy, what have you. And this caused a lot of consternation on the part of people who had been advocating for, a panoply of issues, including identity struggle issues. And so, it kind of it allowed the Hillary campaign to come up with like an agenda to dismiss the Sanders campaign. And it wasn't really fresh. If you followed Occupy Wall Street, when it first set off, it was kind of like, there was no typical Occupy type person. It was all the people there. But then there started to be articles in mainstream newspapers about, well, who are these people in these camps, and what kind of people are they? And then they would come up with this profile. It's a young 20-something white male. And that might have been a majority constituency. I'm not too sure. But it was used as a way to dismiss, in a way, Occupy Wall Street and its focus on political economy. And it's an important story because it's hard to imagine Black Lives Matter developing as it did, when it did. It's hard to imagine the Me Too movement developing as it did, when it did. And then other forms of what I call single issue platform or single issue politics. March for Our Lives, which is about gun control, Women's March, and so on, Sunrise Movement, etc. And recently, all of the Just Stop Oil and similar kind of groups that are affiliated with Extinction Rebellion. And what had happened at that time is that Occupy was a response to the 2008 banking crisis. It was also connected to the Arab Spring. So people disagree about what the Arab Spring was, but basically these are continuations of what was known as anti-globalization protest. So essentially it was taking stock of neoliberalism, the sort of 50 years of neoliberalism that we've had in terms of policy on a global capital level since the 1970s, the end of welfarism, the end of this idea that you should be concerned about other people rather than simply yourself as an entrepreneur, as human capital, who's going to make the best choices and the best decisions for your personal individual career trajectory. So how do we get away from this Thatcherite ideology that the working class to some extent had bought into, and come back to, questions that are of a social nature, solidarity oriented, concern with not only yourself, but with society in general. And anti-globalization was that. And it identified IMF, World Bank, these kinds of institutions of global capital and structural adjustment policies as behind these problems and leading to the banking crisis, which is related to the financialization of the economy. So moving more towards a post-industrial economy as far as quote unquote developed nations are concerned, and moving towards a globalized economy where you could have cheap labor producing goods in third world quote unquote countries, developing quote unquote countries. And then those goods are sold in the developed nations where value added capital makes huge returns for the corporations who are paying barely nothing for the production of these goods, and thereby reestablishing the bargaining strength of developed nations vis-a-vis weaker nations. So the Occupy Wall Street was sort of like a continuation of this anti-globalization protest politics. But instead of going to summits, instead of summit hopping and following the G20 and the G7 everywhere they go, they decided, well, let's just do it here. Like, instead of going to them, we'll bring it to Wall Street. We'll bring it to these places where these institutions are, let's say, not so much changing, convention center all the time. So it was a different tactic for the same agendas by and large. And focused to a large extent on political economy. So in the early 2000s, the aughts, you had a kind of critique, a nascent critique of postmodern theory, a critique of Fukuyama's end of ideology hypothesis, where capitalism is basically the best system since it's the only one that's workable. It's beat out fascism and communism. So now we have to work within this global capitalist liberal world. That had been accepted to a large extent by postmodern academia, let's say the media and government, through neoliberal policy. In the aughts, there was a return to what you might call macro politics. So instead of the micro politics of difference, which was popular in terms of identity issues, you were shifting to this macro political and political economy framework, where you can think about problems like imperialism. You could think about problems like the war on terror and the wars in the Middle East in this global capital context. And what happens is, in some ways, postmodernism made a comeback. The postmodernists in the professions were not comfortable with Occupy Wall Street, unless you were already clearly a leftist. For a while in the 90s there, Marxism was kind of off the table. Discussions of capitalism, you couldn't even use the word. It was like a weird thing to do in the 90s. And so you can talk about these things again. Anarchism made a huge comeback, in part through the popularity of Hart Negri's book, Empire, that was published in 2000. And intellectuals like, on the Marxist communist left, intellectuals like Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, they were sort of like the rising figures at that time. So you had this communist discussion that was happening in relation to, post-Marxism or post-communism in the former East. And so what does it mean today to talk about communism? But you can have these discussions. So there were films like The Young Marx coming out. People were following David Harvey's course, Introduction to Marx's Capital, online. So there was a lot of discussion of this kind of macro political orientation. And so postmodernism sort of had a rebound, let's say, after Occupy Wall Street, and it took the form in terms of organization as I mentioned, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, but also, intellectual trends that had been in academia for a while, but a little bit limited to specific departments and specific intellectuals, sort of became mainstream in academia. So those would include privilege theory, whiteness studies, critical race theory, and intersectionality, especially, and decoloniality more recently. And so, the argument was that, well, we can't just talk about political economy, and we can't just talk about class. You can't talk about class if you don't also talk about race and gender and sexuality. And you can tell that these are postmodern concerns because most of the time they never say religion, and most of the time they never say nationality, which are huge categories that are also part of that whole discussion. And so it's very much an academic discussion that, students are introduced to in undergraduate school. And it's very, I hate to use this word, but it's very empowering because it gives you a lens to look at the world in a way that's very different, that's counterintuitive. So it's not what you had in high school. It's not what you have usually at home with your family or at work. And it sort of, it catapults you into this realm of academic theory, which is, very fascinating. And for an undergraduate student, still a little exotic because you're not at the point where you're producing knowledge. You're at the point where you're consuming knowledge. And so that means that you're being shaped very much by the academy at that point because you're a consumer. You don't really know what your desires are, and you're being told this is going to help you move forward if you want to do graduate studies or use this knowledge in an applied way in some field. And so it's very understandable that young people who want to be responsible to their teachers, to what they've been taught, to take this on board and to take it seriously without necessarily being aware of the ways that this might conflict with a whole set of other protocols or a whole set of other agendas and issues that are not necessarily being discussed in the same context, i.e., Marxism is not being discussed in the same context as intersectionality. Whatever Marxism has to offer is being presented to you within the framework of intersectionality and how intersectionality thinks of class. And so then if you want to have the perspective of, let's say, a Marxist critique of intersectionality, there's not a good chance you're going to get it in the classroom. You might find it online. If there's like a Marxist group that has posted an article on their website, Marxism and intersectionality, something like this, that's maybe where you'll find that information. And so Bernie Bros was I thought it was a good place to start because that was the first line of attack of the Hillary Clinton campaign, this Bernie Bro meme. Now, the book itself is about not so much the 2016 campaign, it's more about the 2020 campaign. Because that's really my concern as a scholar. What I'm interested in is the relationship of class analysis in a Marxist framework, from a Marxist perspective, in relation to identity struggles, identity issues, and something that's completely different, identity politics. Because Marxism has always dealt with identity issues, but Marxism is not identity politics. That's a completely different story. So dealing with those issues was very obvious in the 2020 campaign. But, just on a personal level, even though I'm Canadian and I can't vote in American elections, I was very excited by the Sanders campaign. And I'm not the kind of person who supports the Democratic Party at all. It's a bourgeois party. It's, the death knell, right? For me, it's like as bad as the Republicans. But I was I thought Bernie Sanders, who is this independent candidate most of his life, running to be the leader of the party, that could make a difference. That could, that could shift the entire, conversation, move us all in a direction that we want to go into, that we need to go into. And so I was very excited by the Bernie Sanders campaign, but having experienced the 2016 campaign, how he was criticized for not taking on identity issues, and noticing how this was actually kind of happening, not so much in 2019, more in 2020. And I had written the Obama book. I was hoping it would be published before the election. And I wanted for it to have some kind of impact potentially, right, on these kinds of issues. And so here again, it was the same sort of idea. It was kind of like commenting on what's happening in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And, if the Obama book is called Too Black to Fail, this book is my version of how the Sanders 2020 campaign failed. Not why it failed, because I don't think his campaign actually failed. Like, technically speaking, they won the nomination up until the point it had been stolen from them. It was ripped out of the American public's hands, because he was going to win. It's clear. So they didn't fail, like, technically speaking. And, you could say their strategy worked. I think it's Bernie's agenda that worked. I think it's Bernie's agenda that people wanted and voted for. And I watched the Bernie channel like day in, day out during that year. And I watched over and over again his town halls. I saw his stump speech. I could have given his speech, I had seen it so many times. And so, like, I saw very clearly what he's about, because what he says and the things he talks about, that gives you a good sense of what Bernie's all about. However, when you look at the ads, which is part of one of the chapters in the book, is about the campaign and how the campaign went about marketing Sanders as a candidate, you have a very different picture of what's happening and of how the campaign is being marketed, especially to different constituencies, different identity groups. So the book is a lot about that. It's not the only focus. There's a lot of things happening in and around the campaign with the other candidates who were nominees for the Democratic Party leadership. Some of the issues that happened afterwards, like the January 6th coup attempt, the COVID-19 pandemic, the lab leak, conspiracy theory, all these other issues, but also importantly, the framework that I'm presenting this in, which is the critique of what you could refer to as post-politics. And in relation to that, the professional managerial class, the middle class, petty bourgeois, headspace, social class, social formation within which the Sanders campaign operates. So a review that was written said that I was saying that the Sanders campaign had been captured by the PMC. That's not at all what I'm saying. I do say that identity is a form of capitalist capture. That I say, but you can't say that the PMC is captured by the PMC. No, the PMC is the middle class, right? This is that class. And the person who wrote the review, the very bad review, is a member or is affiliated with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. So what I'm saying in this book is very much all about, in a way, the DSA like worldview, even though they've also been critical of identity politics to a certain extent. But in terms of like the kind of leftism that the DSA represents is very close to the Bernie Sanders campaign. So in critiquing the aspects of that campaign, it's as though I'm critiquing democratic socialism. And so I think that was one of the reasons to write a nasty review, misleading, misinforming review of the book. That's the only one I'm aware of to date. So, Bernie Bro's gone woke. It's kind of, it's basically a description of what happened with the campaign as such, focus on, in part on the advertising. But more importantly, what the book wants to do beyond Bernie Bros going woke, what the book wants to do is address the question, how and in what way and whether or not identity issues advance a socialist politics. To what extent, whether or not it does, if it doesn't, why, if it does, why, how does it advance a socialist politics? So, you would have to say, well, what is for you a socialist, or for me, a socialist politics? And, how does it relate to these issues? And my argument is that the Sanders campaign failed to advance a socialist politics. Maybe that wasn't the point, because Bernie doesn't identify as a socialist per se. But nevertheless, from a Marxist perspective, that this would be my critique and my recommendation as well to people who aren't Marxist, who may be social democratic, who are on the left in this ballpark sense, right? If you're on the left in this ballpark sense, even if you're a left liberal, a progressive liberal, how do identity issues inform the broader political economy and macro politics? That's basically what I want to discuss. And so I refer to this as militant research, in a sense that it isn't this kind of effort at objectivity. I'm coming to these issues from a Marxist point of view, and I'm addressing them from a Marxist point of view. Obviously, that's not going to satisfy everyone's understanding of what's at stake. But that's what I do. And yeah, so I don't know what I wanted to say about that. Oh, right. I wrote another book called Don't Network. And it's this book is about network theory, which was a very popular topic about 6-7 years ago. So, for example, if you'd go to the website of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, they had an exhibition. I forget who the artist is, but let's say it's Pablo Picasso. They would show you a graph, a network graph, and they'd say, here's Pablo Picasso, and here's a line that links him to this other artist, Georges Braque. And Georges Braque, there's a line that links him to another artist, and they both met that person, so there's a line connecting them. And then that person has a dog, and Pablo Picasso pet his dog at one time, so that's part of the network. And this is in this kind of new materialism, assemblage theory, where everything is an object, where agency is not so much the issue as how a material object moves in the world. So it really gets as far away as possible from what you might call humanism, from a human-centered understanding of how things are. And so, and of course, we're using a network right now. Everything that we do is connected, quote unquote. And so that leads to this kind of like very futuristic technophilia that doesn't really address, issues and problems in society. It seems to be like the solution for everything. So with Occupy and with Tahrir Square and some of these encampments, there was a lot of euphoria about the new dangerous class, like young kids with cell phones or young kids with the internet. Like somehow this is an internet revolution or a Facebook revolution. There was a lot of hype around this. And so I wanted to ask the question, do networks facilitate a socialist politics? If so, why? And if not, why not? So it's a similar kind of undertaking that I'm doing with identity politics. One of the differences is that in terms of my own experience, in terms of my own history, having gone through a cultural studies program, identity politics was really the important thing, and the operating system is discourse theory. Foucauldian, Michel Foucault's philosophy and discourse theory. That was the operating system for a lot of this cultural studies kind of work, which comes out of structuralism. It's connected to deconstruction. It's related to all of the identity politics that have been transformed over the years into postmodern academia. So feminism, post-colonial theory, queer theory, any of these kinds of approaches that could easily fit within a discourse theory, Michel Foucault type or approach to issues. And I was, it was horrible. Being in this program was like the worst thing in the world. Of course, I learned a lot. You always learn something, and it can serve you in ways that you didn't expect. But it was horrible to the extent that Marxism was more or less proscribed. You couldn't do Marxism. And in fact, my PhD thesis was blocked by one of my committee members. The program is visual studies. It's like a cultural studies program in an art history department. So what we're looking at is visual studies, which is a new field. And in Rochester, Rochester is the home of Kodak and the George Eastman House, the Eastman School of Music, and there's a whole cinema department at the George Eastman House. And so it makes sense that I have some interest in visual studies. And a lot of the early theorists of visual studies taught in that program. By the time I arrived, many had moved on, so it was already kind of like the next wave and becoming more institutionalized. So now you actually have visual studies departments and journals in almost all these schools. So basically it's postmodern representation, which is, what you find in literary theory as well, instead of aesthetics. So rather than universalist aesthetics, this old sort of Kantian, Hegelian model for the study of art, you've moved into structuralism and all of the methods that were developed more or less since phenomenology and the post-war era. So what's called also known as the new art history. And so basically in that field, if you're doing Marxism, it's old hat. It's like, forget it. Let's just get away from that class stuff. And there were 2 summer institutes that were funded by the Getty Foundation when I was there. And the goal of the institute was to expose, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, to expose scholars from the former East. So people from Russia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, who had been trained in Marxist art history, forced to do it, you could say, how to help them get into this new postmodern, contemporary, post-structuralist approach to visual studies. And, I would go to talks given by people from the Clark Institute, and they would say straight out, like, forget Marxism, forget communism, forget all of this used car salesman type stuff. Get with the program. And I bucked that program. I bucked the system. I tried to, and focused on the work of Henri Lefebvre, who's a Marxist. He's the foremost Marxist philosopher in France. He's not as well known as he could be or should be, but he's as important as Georg Lukács or many of the people we associate with Louis Althusser, etc. In terms of the 20th century Marxism, Western Marxism. And Lefebvre's a very interesting figure because in the post-war era, he quit the Communist Party. And then afterwards, he was thrown out of the Communist Party. But nevertheless, he always remained a Marxist. And he had developed the critique of everyday life, the concept of everyday life that you often find in academia. He pioneered this concept. And then in the 70s, he pioneered another field, which was spatial theory, the production of space that people like Mike Davis have worked with and David Harvey have worked with when they do critiques of postmodern gentrification. And in between this 40s work and the 70s work, what he did was write books that were critical of every postmodern French theorist who came out. So, Julia Kristeva, the Tel Quel group, Jean Baudrillard, Michel Foucault, Paul Virilio, like everyone that you have to study if you want to be a good contemporary critical theorist. He did Marxist critiques of all of their work. And Michel Foucault wrote The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, in 1967. And Lefebvre wrote a book-length critique review of the book Foucault's 66. Lefebvre wrote a critique in 67, a book-length refutation of Foucault's methodology from a Marxist perspective. You're not going to hear about it in cultural studies and in visual studies. It's not helpful to that agenda. And that's what I wanted to do, because I thought, well, if you want to think about the operating system and what it's doing wrong, and why neoliberalism is maybe not such a good idea, and you don't want your theory, your critical theory, to be hinged on neoliberal politics, which is exactly what Foucault's work became over the years, then why not think about it critically? So one of my supervisors, I had 3 people on my committee. This is a visual studies program. When I did my thesis defense, this person didn't look at me the entire defense, except at one moment when he said that Henri Lefebvre was a Zhdanovist. Then he looked me right in the eye, meaning Lefebvre was a Stalinist. And then he looked away, and that was the end. That was the end of that story. So it's about power, right? Visual power, the power to see, to represent, to be seen, and so on. And it's like, if you want to do visual studies, it's discourse theory. Get with the program. So I wrote a thesis that's a little bit off topic. It was. I didn't work on Lefebvre. I worked on other things in contemporary art. And I used a lot of Zizek. So that was okay. Mm-hmm. That was, for whatever reason, that was okay. And, it passed. So Bernie Bro's gone woke. I mean, I said on the Daniel Tutt podcast that I have unfinished business in relation to Rochester and VCS. And so I've been getting back to that unfinished business with these last 4 books, which is basically, because in the 2000s, you could do what you want. You could go back to Marxism. You could think about communism. Then there was Occupy. And then, like I said, in the 2010s, it was back to postmodernism in various ways. And people tried to hybridize it as best as they could. So you'd have like a journal like Commune, which is published in California. And the editors, they're all leftists of a sort, but at the same time, it seems that, they're very much concerned with phallogocentrism and the phallogocentrism of Trump and whoever it is. So basically they're saying, let's not, get rid of everything. Let's keep all of this, cultural studies. It's all part of the mix. Let's not pretend that it's bad. It can be useful. You never know. So the approach ends up being, I'm critical of this, the approach ends up being the quote unquote Deleuzian toolbox. So when you encounter a problem, a particular tool might be more useful in that situation than another one. So don't be a Marxist who is a person with a hammer and who thinks everything is a nail because they have a hammer and that's all they have. If you have other tools at your disposal, then you can have a more eclectic approach. And in academia, that's a wise decision, because if you paint yourself into a corner, that could be like bad for your career. If you paint yourself into a Marxist corner, that's definitely bad for your career.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm working.
I was stunned by a part. It's on page 25 in your book, and I want to share this with the audience. This is within the same aforementioned book, Bernie Bros Gone Woke. It says on page 25, I'm going to read it here to the audience, and maybe you can explain it. It says, given that class consciousness in the U.S. is below 16%, the petty bourgeois cadres inside and outside government are not likely to use class analysis to understand and explain social phenomena. What do you mean below 16% class consciousness?
Yeah, that's a funny thing to say, isn't it? I don't know where I got that. I read that somewhere. Somebody must have done a study, and it does sound like it sounds like this crazy 19th century stuff, doesn't it? Where you quantify something that you can't possibly quantify.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. If you look at unionization, unionization is at 10% in the public sector and 6% in the private sector. I think at its height, unionization in the US was something like 35 to 40%, in the 40s or whatever it is. And it's gone down from there. And if you look at graphs, I mean, I don't know anything about statistics and quantitative methods. I'm like, I did that math course, my first year university. It's like, there are these graphs. The more unionization you have, the more economic equality you have. The less unionization you have, the more you have this breakaway billionaire wealth. And that's because there's no power to take it back from them. There's no way for the masses, the working people, to not only claim what's theirs, but also prevent the billionaire class from getting so rich, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it used to be, you could say something like, "This is worse than in the age of Dickens. This is worse than in the age of robber barons." Now we're worse, or you would say it's as bad as that. They were worse, but now we're worse than they were. We've never been so unequal. And so, how many people want to change that dynamic? And how many people? How do they go? How are they going to go about it? Like, that's the important question, right? You can see the obvious inequality of it. Does it offend you? Does it make you does it give you, do you see the connection between that and these other things? And like, what are you going to do about it? I don't remember where I got that number. It does sound a little bit insane. But while we're on that topic, I do want to say it's worth mentioning. Sorry, I'm changing the subject. We can get back to it. But this book, Bernie Bros Gone Woke, has had some. There's malpractice in relation to this book. I don't know who's responsible. I'm not blaming any particular person. I'm not blaming the publisher. But when you write a book, you work on a Word file, and you review it. You have automated things that help you find mistakes. You reread it a few times till you're satisfied there's no mistakes. Then you send it into a publisher for consideration. When they accept it, they send it to a copy editor. The copy editor will do edits on the Word file, and so you return that. Then it goes to design. Design is what you see basically in a PDF, and that's what gets printed. And some publishers will allow you to do as many corrections to as many proofs as necessary to bring the number of mistakes to zero. The company that Brill is the publisher of the original edition of this book. They work with a company. It's a cost-saving measure. They give you one chance to correct the proof. So if you missed something, It's unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. And then I told them I have a history of being hacked. I'm hacked at the word stage, in the manuscript stage, and I'm also hacked at the design stage. And my files get retroactively replaced so that I cannot verify that I made that mistake or not. Okay, so this has been happening for years, and I tell the publisher this, and it's hard because at that point they start thinking you're crazy, and the relations are not as good. But I did 3 proofs, and I worked down the errors from 42 to 1. The last proof I sent 1 correction. Now, I reread this book for our interview, and I found 27 mistakes, and they're all in the first half of the book. So, if you look at Too Black to Fail, you'll find maybe there's 1 or 2 typos. I don't like typos, so I work hard to eliminate that. Somebody, everything I do is hacked and manipulated. And so this book has turned out a little bit damaged in that regard. But the good thing is that most of these typos don't change the meaning. There's 3 places where the typos affect the meaning. The first is on page 8, where I say the number of people of color who voted for Trump is 57%. It's 13%. Okay, so that's 57. Now you can ask me why 57. That's a good question. My sister turned 57 the moment I was editing this thing. So it could have something to do with that. And I won't go into further details because at some point it starts to be the National Enquirer, But I have explanations for a lot of these typos, actually, why the typo is on that page and what else is mentioned on that page that relates to this ongoing business. But that's one thing. The student debt in the US is 1.3 trillion, not 1.3 million. Big difference. And on page 54, on page, where is it? There's a place where I say substitute, where Oprah is mentioned. I use the word substitute, and it should say replace with. So that's another odd mistake, because the same mistake, the meaning was inverted around substitute. And the same thing happened in Identity Trumps Socialism 5 times when I used the word substitute. So now I know better to not use that word because the meaning will get inverted. I corrected 4 of those 5, but another one made its way into print. So the way I see it, of course, I'm fallible. There's no question about it. And maybe that's payback for writing a book like Too Black to Fail. I don't know. But as far as I would tell you, I didn't make that mistake or these other ones. Also, on page 237, the World Health Organization study of 76,000 people in China to see how the flus or viruses they had, if they were any way connected to COVID, that would have been before the end of 2019 and not 2021. So just a little bit of housekeeping there. There's nothing I can do. It's in print. It's out there. The book review I mentioned made a point of this number of people who voted for Trump. So, the way I look at it from the conspiracy theory sort of headspace that I live in, that's just adding insult to injury. Somebody harping on a mistake that they know was hacked in. But of course, they have plausible deniability. I don't, because it's my book. It's my name on it.
I wanted to, because you mentioned, and I know we're going to get into the speeches, like a few clips of Bernie during his campaign when he was running. He ran 2 separate campaigns, obviously, in 16 and 20. And I was watching some videos like in anticipation of this interview. I actually have notes here that I saved from back in late April from the first time that we had, our interview with episode 118. And I was in preparation for this particular book, Bernie Bros Gone Woke, in addition to the Obama book. I'm curious about the language use of some of these speeches during campaign season, because I noticed that Trump now is using the Kamala's a communist line like so much now. It's just MAGA people just going crazy because Kamala's a communist, which is just, if you're
Preposterous.
if you're thinking just in terms of politics, it's just the fact that this is so effective.
Mm-hmm.
It just shows you the propaganda. It's also a reflection to me of just like low information voters in general. And low information voters exist all over the political spectrum.
Yeah.
The fact that this is even able to have any traction is just ridiculous. You have Elon Musk regurgitating the same type of stuff, the nonsense. But I noticed with Bernie, even someone like a Donald Trump, which I still view as enigmatic in ways, because if you ask me, Trump is pretty much with this two-party system being basically like a one-party type scenario when it comes to just
Can
who
I stop
gives.
you there, Kiko?
What's that?
Can I stop you there?
Okay.
You can continue that question. It's just already it's a hornet's nest, you know.
Hmm.
I mean, when Donald Trump calls Kamala Harris Comrade Kamala, it's hilarious, right? It's like when he says, I laugh every time I read this in the news, you know, when he says that the Biden family are Marxists, you know, the first, I mean, of course, you're going to want to clarify those mistakes, right? You're going to want to say, well, no, they're neoliberals and so on and so forth. And this is kind of like it's very clever, like maybe in ways that are not planned, because it's like commodity fetishism, right? The first chapter of Capital is commodity fetish. You're presented with a bright, shiny object. You know, you don't see who made it, right? You don't see the pain and suffering. You don't see the exploitation. You just see this, like, you know, this nice car that you can't afford to buy that you made, right? And what Marx wants to do with that chapter is of course, he wants to demystify and he wants to get into the production process and talk about like how this works in terms of political economy, but he doesn't want to deny the metaphysical subtle. What does he say? How does he put it? Yeah, the metaphysical subtleties of the commodity. And so, a lot of leftist analysis is this kind of like encyclopedic fact finding, where you say that's false and this is the truth and this is the objectivity and this is the joke, or this is just a whatever. But you know what people like about Trump is that he's funny. You know, he's like he's a good entertainer. And I watched a 4-part series about Trump that came out about a year ago. I don't remember what it's called, but you see him and you see him with his team of people. I mean, it's a critique of Trump, but really it's also an advertisement for Trump. And you see how he like strategizes all of this stuff. And you could even say, given that he used to be a Democrat, you could even say that to some extent, you know, Trump is a neoliberal like the rest of them.
That's what I was getting at
He's
with
a
it.
he's a globalist, right? He's in a sense that what he's concerned with is capitalism, and this is a global class of oligarchs, of billionaires, and they're all in the same club, more or less. They have different tactics. To what extent he's sexist, racist, homophobic? I mean, he's willing to do anything, and he's gone overboard, right? He's gone past the point of you know, clowning around. You know, there are lives at stake, but these are not lives that the Democrats care about either. So you know, so the thing is like Jody Dean wrote an article about this. Is the pleasure that Trump takes in giving speeches and going out there and doing his crazy stuff is something that happens in all politics when it's focused on a particular person, a cult figure, is that you enjoy through them. So the word that Zizek uses is interpassivity. We don't want to be what anarchists say we should be, which is activist about everything all the time. sometimes you need to rest, you need to relax, and you can't be politicizing everything that happens, right? So there's like passivity in life, right? Like when we're resting. So if you're after a day's work, you watch television, it's not a very good comedy. So they put on a laugh track, and the laugh track does the work of laughing for you. And, so that's why a good comedian doesn't laugh at his own jokes, right? They wait for the laugh to come from the audience, and then they continue. So what Trump does is he kind of allows you to enjoy through him, right? Through his inanities. And so he's willing in a way to debase himself, to debase politics, and to turn it into this circus. And it's like WWF, in the sense that in this ring, on one side, you've got the heel, you've got the bad guy, and on the other side, you've got the good guy wrestler. And so that would be Kamala Harris. And so they throw insults at each other. AOC is leaning heavily into this kind of like jouissance stuff. And a lot of the jouissance tends to be, and it's not surprising, it's indicative, a lot of the pleasure and enjoyment in this, I'm using it in a Freudian psychoanalytic sense, a lot of the pleasure and enjoyment is around identity. It's around these things that are prejudicial and these kind of like guardrails. Don't say something racist, don't say something sexist, and then transgressing those rules. But it doesn't often happen around economics, right? Those are the kind of things they don't want to talk about, right? Because they want people sort of preoccupied with these things that prevent you from getting to, what might be the more critical points. So from a Marxist point of view, like if you're a Marxist, your understanding of historical materialism and political economy are the same. Basically, you used to have slave societies. That shifted to feudal societies. The feudal system broke down, and it was replaced by a capitalist system in, let's say, like the 15 to 1700s. Now we have a capitalist system. And what Marxism was doing that's different from socialism in the 1800s is that socialists would say, well, these bourgeois, they're idealists, and they're all Christians. They're all Christian. They all go to church on Sunday, and they exploit like hell the rest of the week. And so if we criticize their religion, their Christianity, we'll be able to sort of get to the facts, like of what's really going on here. And so you have this guy Feuerbach who comes up with a theory of, this idea that God is an invention. It's the human beings created this figure called God. They alienated themselves from it. And so what they need to do is come back to themselves, but forget God. And so it was the same thing with the commodity, right? You have commodity production. The utopian socialists, they simply wanted to rearrange society so that we're all sharing. And Marx wrote a critique of this called the poverty of philosophy, how all of these people are not really good thinkers. They're not really subtle philosophers. What Marx said is that the religion of the bourgeoisie is not Christianity. The religion of the bourgeoisie is capitalism. And why is that? The reason is they don't understand it. They have these theories coming from Ricardo and Adam Smith, but if you look at it, does it explain what's actually happening in the economy? No, it doesn't. It's so far away that it can't be accurate. So, how do you understand it better than the liberal economists? In that regard, Marxism is connected to liberal philosophy, because it's taking on board the economic theories of the time, but it's submitting them to a critique. So Marx isn't doing political economy. He's not saying, let's get back to political economy. He's saying, let's do a critique of political economy. So this is the difference. The difference is the Marxist view of class is the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, they don't have a problem with the working class. They like the working class. They like that class to be working. They want them to work, And if they have unemployment, it's not because they don't like those people, it's because unemployment is helpful to keep the others working, because they'll be afraid to become unemployed. So you want what's called structural unemployment. If you keep a certain amount of people unemployed that are employable, then the other ones will be afraid to lose their jobs. And so this idea of class is that we accept that there's a group of people called the working class, and that there's a group of people called the capitalist class. And so this is the labor capital contradiction, which is basically the religion of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie wants that structure to stay like that indefinitely. The Marxist doesn't. The Marxist wants to destroy class society, which means, like the way the bourgeoisie got rid of kings and queens, we can get rid of the capitalist class. They're a parasitic class. They don't do anything that we can't do ourselves. They just steal the profit, and they control democracy, and they turn it into something else. So it isn't what the liberal economists wanted. It's become a system that's decrepit. The liberals had good reason to think what they thought at that time, because you lived in a world of scarcity, and people would starve. There was extreme poverty. And so you wanted to create wealth, and industry was a way to create wealth. Even though it's based on exploitation and the expropriation of profit, you're creating with that profit wealth. So you can use that profit to build roads, to build factories, to build libraries and schools. And so the bourgeois philosophy made some sense in this early context. But over time, as it becomes exploitative, everybody who's pushed off their farms into the cities, into factories, they're stuck in this world where they were better off as a farmer. At least they could do things in their own time. At least they didn't have to work in bad conditions. They weren't dying from whatever it is they're making. And so they realized that their life is worse off. So they organized as organized labor. And so you get socialism, you get anarchism, and you get the development of first, second, third, fourth internationals. And today, in the post-war era, we live in what Galbraith calls the affluent society. So the liberal economists, they were right to want to create wealth, because you didn't want people starving. So they could always justify their exploitation of workers with the idea that at least it's good for them. At least I'm creating wealth. I can pay them wages. They won't starve to death. Since we have now an industrial society and everything is property based anyhow, right? You're not just going to give the money away. They won't know what to do with it. It's better if we organize it, because we're the entrepreneurs. But in an affluent society, in a very educated society, it's harder to make that argument. So what you need to do is you need to convince people that they need things they don't need, like all this surplus production, this overproduction, which is unnecessary in terms of the basic necessities. However, in order to keep that going, you end up also having to think about problems of nationalism and imperialism. So that system becomes imperialist, colonialist, and it also is nationalist at the same time. So the national borders keep the workers in check, where global capital can go wherever it wants. And so you get World War I, where Marx is saying the workers have no country. There's working class that are exploited the same way everywhere you go. And they're exploited by their bourgeoisie. Yet what happens in World War I? Instead of the French workers fighting against the French bourgeoisie and the German workers fighting against the German bourgeoisie, you've got the German bourgeoisie getting the German workers to kill French workers, and the French bourgeoisie getting French workers to kill German workers, and vice versa, and so on and back and forth. So basically, to make the story short, identity politics provides the same type of problem, or creates the same type of problem as nationalism did in World War I and World War II, except on a micro-political, civil society level. It's more local, it's more like in the workplace, it's more at school, but it's a similar thing. You've got workers fighting against each other for, whatever it is, a job in the middle class, a job in media, in academia, and whatever it is. Sanders tried to meld these two things. He tried to bring them together for two reasons. First of all, the Democrats used to be way ahead of the Republicans when Obama was in power. By the time Obama was finished his 2 terms, the Democrats had sunk to the same low level of popularity as the Republicans. So Hillary and Trump in 2016 were the most unpopular candidates in human history. Bernie Sanders was an alternative. The Hillary campaign stabbed him in the back through the DNC, right? Through the Democratic National Committee. They blocked Bernie through a bunch of, shenanigans, and Trump won. So then you get, well, she wrote a book, What Happened, right? Russiagate, it's the Russians that did it. Or WikiLeaks, it's Julian Assange that did it because of the hacked emails. And that's why we lost to Trump. So that was one, that they spun that for a long time, right? 3 years, the Mueller investigation, it came up empty-handed because it was just a diversion. And the other one was the reason for Trump. Why did Trump win? Well, the white working class. It's resentment. It's people who resented the fact that, I'm not saying this is what is the case, but this is what was said quite a lot. People resented having had a black man in power for 8 years, and they didn't want this woman in power for another 4 years. So it was kind of like this reaction to identity politics. Mm-hmm. But, and so, so they kind of gave us this Bernie bro guy, this kind of like working class white guy who doesn't want to be replaced by, BLM, Me Too, or whatever it is, DEI mandates and all of these kinds of things. So they created a specter. They scapegoated the working class. And you still have this today, right? With AOC, she's constantly criticizing people who criticize her blend of sort of like woke activism with, neoliberal imperialist policy. I got off track. You had said something about jouissance. Comrade Kamala.
It was more a comment, but it was going to lead into a question. And then if you want to, you can kind of, because I know you have some things to show as far as like some of the clips from Bernie's campaign, but it was simply kind of the game that Trump plays as a marketing strategy is kind of the way I look at it. I contend that he is like a Democrat in disguise, whatever that means, because we've kind of killed the meaning of any kind of meaningful political language. The language is used is simply to solidify these low information voters and these bases, which is what we see now. And I noticed with Bernie, for instance, Trump does not go in the same way as he does a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden. Even with Jill Stein and even with people who are more adjacent to socialism, he doesn't do that. It's a calculation. So that tells me that he knows the actual meanings of these words, but he chooses to kind of sell another message to a different audience because he's a shrewd person. He's not that dumb like he comes across, and the way people accuse him of being that way. He's actually very smart when it comes to the way he markets like these different ideologies and these buzzwords. I mean, that's what he's a marketing strategist is what he is, and he does a good job at it. Because even with Bernie, he almost in a way admitted that Bernie had good policy platforms, and so he would have to approach Bernie from a different perspective.
Yeah,
but someone like a Kamala, they're more wide open, and so that he kind of exposes the Democrats. And their kind of anti-socialist rhetoric themselves, because I know you remember that Biden said he defeated the socialists. The last election, he said that he defeated Bernie, the socialist. So he's exposing the fact that Democrats are anti-socialist, while at the same time exaggerating and embellishing the whole idea that Democrats are communists, which is just it's insane. But he kind of gets the best of both worlds because people have kind of doubled down into like, screw the communists, screw the socialists. So everyone else is joining the same parade. And I don't know if people are actually understanding how propagandized this is, but maybe they don't care that it's propaganda. They just go along with the program.
Yeah, it fits the overall conservative politics of small government, like this rhetoric of small government. So socialism would be, trying to like do social engineering through the state. So that would be bad because it would, hamper the freedom of enterprise, free enterprise, and so on. So, it kind of satisfies that while at the same time being this kind of like, it's almost nostalgia for the Cold War, or I don't know what you want to call it, but this kind of easy target. And that's what he's always doing, scapegoats, easy targets. And of course, we're both agreed that, it's a uniparty, that it was clear they would rather lose to Trump in 2020 than lose to Sanders, the Democrats, the centrists. So like we're agreed on that point, right? It's a uniparty. And so, let's get away from the uniparty. I mean, there are people who follow this more closely than I do, but the work that I'm doing, it's like I always present this in the simplest of terms. There are three political ideologies, essentially: socialism, liberalism, and fascism or conservatism. On the left, you have anarchists, socialists, communists. With liberals, you have neoliberals as well. And with conservatives, you have like the far right as well. But it's ABC. The American political system is strictly B and C. You can have social democracy in the United States in a really small way, right? So you can have like a third party candidate who might be social democrat or democratic socialist, whatever you call it. But from a Marxist perspective, if you look at, the Marxist thinking of the early 20th century, fascism is not really separate per se from capitalism. Fascism is a rescue operation for capitalism in crisis. When capitalism can't do what it wants to do in a nice way, it'll do it in a nasty way. And fascism is the expression of that. Colonialism, imperialism is the expression of that. Now, on the left of capitalism, there's workers' politics, social democracy. For a communist, for a Marxist, social democracy is not a socialist politics. It's the left wing of capitalism. And so, so when we talk about, Biden being an FDR kind of guy, Biden being pro-union, Sean Fain of the UAW being a good UAW representative, it's basically a social democratic politics that is the left wing of bourgeois politics. And so, as I was saying, I hadn't finished that idea. Marxism doesn't want better wages, better working conditions for workers. Marxism wants to get rid of the wage relation. It wants to get rid of property relations, the relations of social relations that are based on property regimes. That doesn't mean that you don't have your stuff, your house, your car. It means that big properties, like, for example, the internet should be a public utility, right? All of these things that could be socialized wealth that everybody depends on, they don't have to be, something that is produced for profit. So you can have a functional economy in a sense of people making things, but when it comes to the big, like mining, energy, transportation, education, healthcare, these things should be socialized. People say nationalized, whatever, socialized, it's the same idea. And so that's the kind of big government that conservatives don't want, because they want to turn those things that are social goods, commons, and they want to fence them in, privatize them, and make profit off of it. So, like the healthcare system in the US, you have expensive insurance, and that means that healthcare costs are 5 times higher than in a country like Canada. Of course, there's a lot of profit there, and that profit can be invested. and you put somebody's name on the wing of a hospital, or you put somebody's name on a research center because they're the ones who were the philanthrocapitalists who funded the thing. But why, like, why do that? That's like charity. Charity is this old idea. We don't need charity in a modern society. It's dumb. It's like giving all of this shared wealth to one person who can screw it up by sending rockets to the moon that don't work. The idea is to get rid of class. And so, in my debate with intersectionalists don't want to get rid of class. They want race, class, gender, sexuality, and they're happy that class is there in that group. Stay there. And what happens is that because these are identity groups, they treat class as if it's an identity group, but it isn't. Class is not a matter of discrimination, because you're not allowed to discriminate legally. It's against the law, but you are allowed to exploit. It is the law. It's like it's what you go to school to learn to do, right? If you go to business school and law school, it's like you're supposed to defend that system. So intersectionality is based, and the Combahee River Collective is an example of that. It's a system that accepts that we have a capitalist system. Ultimately, it can't think outside that very narrow parameter. And the reason why? Well, because identity, right? So it's kind of like, it's sort of a reversal. It's a positive version of, why can't we have a ceasefire in Gaza? Well, because of anti-Semitism, So it's this kind of like, well, you can't have a universalist progressive approach because identity, like, so either in a positive or in a negative way. So that you never have the capital labor conflict directly presented. If you had the capital labor conflict, you wouldn't have C. Like, a B and C would be in the same, B and C, liberalism and fascism, they'd be in the same category. And then you'd have the left who's against all of that. But you never have a direct expression of this conflict. And so the simple formula that I use is 1 + 1, labor plus capital plus A. 1 + 1 + A. So A is the third term that prevents this conflict from being expressed directly. So this would be like, for example, in Nazi Germany, the scapegoat of the Nazis are the Jews. We would have a nice society. Everything would be a paradise over here if it wasn't for these Jews. And so we have to exterminate them. Now, obviously, for Nazism, it's more than just Jews. It was all kinds of things, because it was all in the interest of an authoritarian regime that was trying to rebuild the economy, but also on a capitalist basis that it thought was socialist, or said it was socialist. So it was also gays, it was also blacks, it was also intellectuals, artists, anybody who's like not on board with this Nazi agenda for good reason. And so you have 1 + 1 + A, labor plus capital plus Jew, the excluded scapegoat. So that's what Trump is doing. What the Democrats do is 1 + 1 plus anti-racism. So the 1 + 1 plus Arab Americans, 1 + 1 plus Black Americans, 1 + 1 plus
LGBTQ.
Right? So yeah, so just recently, AOC gave an interview to a guy. How do we get people on board with the Democrats? And he asked about Gaza, I think, because he was saying Gaza could hurt Kamala Harris in the not the primaries, but in
the swing states.
Yeah, in the swing states. Her answer was her answer was genocide because trans people and abortions. Like, that was the formula, right? So it's kind of like, and it's not easy to dismiss, because nobody wants to be racist, sexist, homophobic. So obviously, because you're not those things, you presume to be, it's like a gateway drug. to
Mm-hmm.
neoliberal. So then the question becomes, how do we give credence to struggles, solidarity, but at the same time, not kind of like weaken the type of politics that would do the most to help all of these groups? Unfortunately, much of the PMC is not concerned with that question in that way. It doesn't always know what it's doing. It's like a political unconscious, right? So, I mean, that's what's weird about Trump, because you got to wonder, is this all like prepared ahead of time, or does he just come up with this? And he swims in it because I guess he watches Fox News all the time, and so he's kind of like immersed himself in that headspace. So the headspace that I'm trying to create, or I'm interested in, is not one that's very welcome on the left, in fact. There's a theorist, you may have heard of him, David Roediger.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book called The Wages of Whiteness. It's about the question of what Du Bois called the psychological wage. And Du Bois was talking about a period in American history where he was asking, why is it around the turn of the century that white workers in the South did not align with Black workers? Like, what prevented them from aligning? And the answer that Du Bois suggested somewhere, that Roediger based his book on, is that, well, they don't receive material gains from being racist. They receive psychological pleasure, like a psychological wage. It's completely imaginary. It's completely fantasy. It would be more to their advantage to align with Black workers against the ruling class, but they're satisfied with this, what I've rephrased as the wages of wokeness, which is the flip side to the same problem. But what Roediger doesn't do, he blames the white working class, basically, ultimately, I'd say. He doesn't blame the ruling class. It's the ruling class that's offering white working people these psychological wages. So that's what Trump is doing when he's saying things like Comrade Kamala. Like, I laugh when I hear these things. So I've accepted his psychological wage. It's like, thank you, Donald Trump. It's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what won him tons of media coverage in 2016, because every time he said something crazy, he was on the news. And so he got much more news coverage than anyone else. And as I mentioned in the book, low information voters get more information from commercials, TV advertisements, than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of news coverage is like free advertising on top of the paid advertising. And so he got wall-to-wall coverage. Now, could he do that twice after January 6th? It's like, and it's kind of like, well, he ran on economic nationalism. He's still kind of running on economic nationalism, which the Democrats aren't doing, right? The Democrats are saying, no, it's going to be neoliberalism. There's really no alternative, right? A la Margaret Thatcher, Tina, there's no alternative. So again, that's them. They're kind of like, they're easy to see at this point. As far as low information voters, it's like, this is an interesting question because, leftists always blame the people in power. Do we really want to blame the masses? Do we want to blame the people for doing these things? Like, is it not ultimately like we're given the right to vote? We could vote and we can educate ourselves and figure out who to vote for if we wanted to. So why does it not happen, right? Why does this ideological screen seem to kind of like control people like zombies, kind of like against their will, right? So there's different ways to address that issue. I mean, the concept of ideology, which is fundamental to Marxist analysis, is important, right? That's why when the DSA type leftist is talking always about material gains, show people like this would be better for you. You could afford, your rent, you could afford housing, you could afford all of these things. They tend to leave out the ideological battle, that battleground, right? Which is also the cultural sector. It's also the cultural battleground. And we saw how Hollywood leaned in very heavily to the Oscars so white critique. They introduced quotas, right? So if you want to be nominated for a Hollywood Oscar, you have to have representation in terms of main characters or behind the scenes in terms of the people working on set, and these sort of additional questions. So that's kind of like the administration of culture. It's one thing for an artist to be politicized and to do those things. It's another if that's become like a mandate. That's become like, well, if you want to go for an Oscar, you're going to have to do these things. So then you get companies like Margot Robbie, who plays Barbie in the Barbie movie. She has a production company called Lucky Chap, and they came out like around 2016. And so they're dedicated to stories that center the lives of minority figures, especially women. So there are a number of production companies that have that as basically their goal. And so, Barbie's a perfect example of that kind of film. And it's all about, likewise, in the toy industry, Mattel wants to, give profits to their shareholders. So we have to sell a lot of dolls. And so if people want dolls that look like them, well, we're going to do that. We're going to give them, this Barbie, that like a handicap Barbie, Down syndrome Barbie, trans Barbie. There's a Barbie in every shape and size, but they're all Barbies. And they're always contrasted to the original, like stereotypical Barbie. And so like the movie's like basically a meta comment on this like relationship with the original Barbie and these other Barbies. And there's a whole like history there also in terms of representation. But the Bernie Sanders campaign is similar, right? So you have Arab Bernie supporter, you have Latino Bernie. So it's like the united colors of Sandernistas, the united colors of Bernie. And the point at which that fell apart, for me anyways, was his slogan was not me, us. So he didn't want it to be about him. And that was good marketing because Clinton was going after Sanders. And so Sanders was saying, look, I'm popular with the electorate. They want these things that are on my platform. So it's not me. It doesn't matter exactly what I am. It's more about these issues. But at the point where Bernie was out of the race and he had to, like in 2016, it made sense in a way for him to stay in so that he could run again in 2020. We wanted him to be an independent in 2016. He didn't choose that route. He stayed in, and you thought maybe it was worthwhile for him to stay in because look, he can do it again. He's running again as the Democratic leader. He canvassed for Hillary Clinton to no end, and it was never good enough for her, right? She kept criticizing he's not doing enough. So they could have somebody to blame, if they lost the election. So, when he lost, then all of a sudden, even in the last debate, as a matter of fact, at the last debate, before he was out of the race with Joe Biden, it would have been nice to see him say the same things from his platform against Biden. But it was all this, my friend Joe, And at that point, it was no longer, it's not us, not me, us. At that point, it was me and my friend Joe. So it's like, what happened to us, right? Like, why, and there was a program on a podcast called Politics Joe, an interview with Bernie Sanders about, I don't know, maybe 4 months ago or something like that. And, he was asked a lot of questions. He answered all of these questions. So you see everything he stands for. And then at the end, he supports Joe Biden, which is a complete, capitulation to what you don't stand for. So it's hard to explain. I mean, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes in the Senate and in government in the U.S. Like, why he stays in there? Does he feel he could be more effective on the inside than on the outside? But he's terrible on foreign policy, right? He's still okay on a lot of the same platform points on domestic issues. He's still saying the same thing, but on foreign policy, he was never good. And now he's demonstrated, that he's willing to support genocide.
Well, I'm not too surprised by that. And maybe it was kind of good for people to see, I won't say true colors, because, I mean, he's been pretty consistent in his political career. It's just a matter of people seeing these different multifaceted aspects of their favorite politicians and realizing that they're flawed individuals, and they have a lot of contradictory elements within their own political economy. But I wanted to say, before we get into some of like the clips that you're about to show, before we conclude, I wanted to pose a question to you, because it's a question that you admitted that you didn't really understand it, as far as like why the Democrats aren't really going in on the January the 6th event.
Mm-hmm.
I have my own theory about it, but I'm curious to hear your take. Like, why do you think? Because you obviously brought it up. Why don't the Democrats, even now in 2024? We're talking about someone. If you're of the contention that this was a coup, which I don't agree with that assessment, but if you are in the camp that this was a coup, January the 6th, why wouldn't those people use that against Trump? And we're talking about 2024, and they're not even using it to that degree. And you're writing this book in a different context, even now. And you were saying to yourself, why come they're not using it? Why don't you think that they use? Why come you don't believe that they're using it against them?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if they're not using it against them. I guess I haven't listened to enough speeches. Kamala Harris, she just became the chosen nominee. So, she's probably not going to bring it up. I'm sure she won't. Look, there's collusion in different at different levels. I mean, I'm always to the left of these. I'm like off Broadway, I'm always to the left of these issues. The question I ask is not why the neoliberals don't bring it up, because like we've already agreed, it's a two-party, it's a uniparty, right? They're the good and bad side of the same neoliberal global capitalist agenda. And one helps the other, right? One serves the other. So like, why do we not have the ratification of Roe v. Wade? Because they can dangle it like a carrot at every election, And so it's similar. I thought, you've got the rise of far-right parties a bit everywhere in the Western world now. And, it's like Canada, we have a conservative Poilievre. So he's kind of like a little Trump, and it looks like he might beat Justin Trudeau, like go figure, but there's always it always vacillates, right? People get tired of a party, then they go the other way, and then they come back, and it's kind of like the pendulum swings. January 6th, if you look at it as such, like I say in the book, when it was happening, you didn't hear a word. Obama didn't go on Twitter and say, what the hell? Joe Biden didn't. Joe Biden asked Donald Trump, who's the leader of the coup attempt. I mean, whatever you want to call it, it was an attempt to stop the ratification of the vote. So it was an attempt to interfere with the vote results. It was saying stop the count, and it's called Stop the Steal unofficially. And it's like, then we'll do recounts in these other states where they're trying to bribe people to change the results. And if you don't think it's a coup, well, look at Trump v. US, right? The Supreme Court case, Trump versus the United States. There's a coup. That's a coup, because it now allows, and this is according to Supreme Court justices, their comments after the case was won. Trump won a case against the US Supreme Court, that now a standing president can commit crimes and not be persecuted or not be prosecuted for those crimes. So we could say, Obama, what he did to kill American citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki, was illegal, and he could be taken to court for that. The chances are that the system would do this are not likely, but it's a crime nevertheless. Now Trump could do this, or Kamala Harris could do this, and they would suffer no consequences. They have the right to do it. So for the first time in American history, since the founding of the United States, you have a president that has been given dictatorial powers. They're now above the law. That's a coup. It's a legal coup, but nevertheless, or it's a legally ratified coup. Now, supposedly it's going to go through the legal system, and it might come back and it might be revised. But that happened. And so it gives you a sense of where Trump is at, right? Like what his agenda is. And when he jokingly says to his supporters, to the base, once I'm elected, you won't have to worry about elections anymore. You won't have to go vote every 4 years. That'll be over. Okay, so this is, of course, crazy, like Donald Trump craziness, but he's saying this. He's saying we're moving towards an authoritarian system. And so the way I look at the coup attempt, I see it as an advertisement. Like, I think of it as an advertisement. Let's do this. Let's see how far we could get away with it. Obviously, it's not going to be, it isn't going to be like you have in some cases where they actually go in and shoot all the politicians, and then there's a new regime. But they would have stopped the ratification of the vote. And this is the reason for the concerted stand down of the National Guard. Everything in the Department of Defense was organized ahead of time so that the National Guard, which is 20 minutes away from the Capitol building, was blocked and prevented from going in and assisting Capitol Police, who also had orchestrated a stand down to different degrees. Some of the police felt that they had been betrayed by their superiors. Other police were collaborating, Capitol Police. So so this was a concerted stand down. It wasn't a failure of security. All of these things that could have been used to manage the site in terms of police were taken apart days before, like the bike racks that are used for crowd control. They had been removed. Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., had asked for extra security that day, and they denied her request. They said it would be a bad look, that we're trying to prevent American citizens from, expressing themselves. And it was also conceived as retribution for the George Floyd protests by a lot of people in the administration. So what did the Democrats do after all this? First of all, they said to Trump, call off this thing you're doing. And he didn't. He waited 4 or 5 hours until he tweeted, okay, now you can go home.
You can go home.
Now there's 6 people dead. Now there's this many people injured. Now you could go home. And it seems to me that it functions a little bit like an advertisement in terms of the reaction, not the event itself, but the response and the reaction to it. To what extent are people going to tolerate this kind of thing? How is the mainstream media going to deal with this? Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to get into moral panics, right? Especially when you're being taunted by the far right. You don't want to play their game. So I can understand that many people on the left, they downplayed it. They said that, Oh, it was only 5,000 people. It was a ragtag team of, like they had no real ability to affect the outcome. And so just play it down and let's get back to more important things. I find that's an unacceptable response. Like the response, the fact that charges were brought to so many people is very important. But the fact that those charges didn't go all the way up the food chain, right, to the people who were ultimately responsible for this. Like if you look at the Trump assassination attempt just recently, the person in charge of security services, I don't know who it is, what department, but she had to step down from her job. We didn't see this with January 6th, right? What we saw was a 9/11 style commission that is still kind of, sputtering on, and that doesn't want to come to what it wants is, fall guys, a lot of fall guys who are part of these kind of right-wing groups. They're happy to go to jail for 5 years and to come out and do it again. You know what I mean? These people are kind of like out there. And they're happy that the main guy wasn't affected. It wasn't touched by this, right? And all of these people in the Pentagon, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the only department that did the right thing before and anticipating January 6th is the Department of Justice, from what I can tell. For the rest, it's the rank and file. Some of the rank and file who were upset about the whole thing. Some people quit their jobs and so on. But in terms of, and then afterwards, it was all, well, we need a strong Republican. We need a strong Republican Party. We need a strong Republican Party. That's everything that Joe Biden said about it. And they increased the budget by they called to increase the budget by $2 billion for Capitol Police. For what? Why?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need extra. All you needed was for those people to be able to do their jobs the way they're expected to, and that would have been enough. So, it's basically testing, I think, testing the limits of how far you could go. And, when somebody's doing that, it's like the Overton window. It keeps moving further and further to the right, this is what worries them. What worries them is organized, or the people, the masses, the working class, organizing themselves against that system, against neoliberal global capitalism in its various expressions. And they don't want that. And it's, just as terrible as the militarism that we have today, the economic inequality is the climate crisis. And we've gone so far away from that in the last few years, right? Since Trump, it's like Biden doesn't even talk about it. He was supposed to stop fracking on federal land.
Yeah, right.
And, all he's doing is making it easier for fossil fuel extraction. So we're not getting to those things that are ultimately potentially going to destroy humanity in maybe like 70 years from now. Instead, we're going to those things that could destroy humanity tomorrow, right? If there's a nuclear exchange, if we start using tactical nuclear weapons, that would trigger a snowball effect that none of us would come out of. And the real question is, ultimately, the real question is the United States prepared to accept that it's lost its standing in the world? Is the United States prepared to understand that the 20th century was the American century, but the 21st century isn't? It's not going to be. It isn't. And what does that imply? And does that mean that you can continue with the sort of USA number one logic that you find, in the DNC and the RNC, with its different kind of cultural expressions, two versions of the similar kind of insanity, right? So how do you get on a progressive track is, the question. Social Democrats, I can appreciate that they don't think that you can go too hard with a socialist, communist, Marxist agenda. In fact, there are people of this persuasion that don't even want it, right? They're not interested in it, but they understand the interest of the radical revolutionary legacy for progressive momentum. So they'll draw on certain aspects of it to a limited degree to try to bring things in a more reasonable, more rational direction, in a progressive direction, so that we could see some gains for people, more taxation of corporations, all of these small steps, but in the right direction. But it seems that we can't have that, right? We can't have that because IPAC. We can't have that because Putin, or some other reason.
Yes. Let's transition into the Bernie slides, just due to time constraints, because I want to make sure that we definitely get this part of the presentation in. I definitely appreciate your response to the question about January the 6th. I do appreciate a detailed response. And I think there's some validity to what you said. I think some of this is just definitions vary from person to person. I believe that there was government collusion. You had made comments about government collusion. I believe that there's just so much more that we don't get access to that other people do have access to. I believe that. And there was plenty of time ahead to anticipate something like that happening. And the fact that there was nothing kind of organized or counter-organized in that regards is just it just raises my skepticism a lot more. And people's behaviors are very telling. You would think that there would be a perfect opportunity to exploit a person if you really don't want them to be in control. But again, when you have all these things happening behind closed doors, maybe it's in other people's interest to not have a Bernie type person in and have a Trump person in, because we know that Trump is not going to be in, even if he wins this time around. You can't duplicate Trump in 2028. He's not going to be there anymore. And so you're going to have a situation where the Republican Party is going to have to rebrand itself as such and such. And then the Democrats are going to promise people that they're going to go left again. I mean, of course, it's this same circus show, and this cycle happens too often, in my opinion. But again, I criticized in an episode. I did an episode with the Tracy Carson show last week. I was invited onto a show, and I made the point that left groups outside of the duopoly don't do a good enough job organizing. And I understand that there's lots of things going against those groups, but at the same time, there should be at least a unity ticket. The fact that we have Claudia de la Cruz, we have Cornel West, and we have Jill Stein running against each other in a sense, and not having a unity ticket of any sort, it's kind of confusing to me. And just tapping into all the independents that are out there, because we know the independents in the United States are the largest voting bloc. Even if you had a unity ticket within those elements and they tapped into those independent elements, that's enough to get 5% funding for the subsequent election in 2028. To me, that should be the goal, is to get public funding. You have to start from somewhere. You're not going to beat the duopoly in one election cycle. But these people, I don't think, are thinking it through well enough. And even the libertarians, the free market libertarians, and some of the Kennedy people and some of the people who are in the independent circles there, you could easily get a 5% threshold if you agreed to certain issues and certain constraints, like cabinet positions. Even now, that's what they're doing on the other side. These people are having backdoor deals. You're going to be in my cabinet. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. People have to think a little bit smarter, in my opinion. And that's a critique that I have, even as someone that's an independent themselves and someone that does not support either party. I think people need to take organizing seriously, and they need to look beyond the election cycle instead of popping up 6 months before the election. That would be my critique of those people.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a distinction. I'm coming to this as in terms of revolutionary politics.
I understand that.
Not pragmatic politics. So, these kind of like what I refer to in the book as compromise formations. I mean, that's all we hear. And in academia, that's all it is, right? That's what I was bucking in VCS in the 90s. and I'm still bucking it today. And so, I don't believe in allyship, for example. I believe in comrades, and, comrades don't let comrades vote for RFK.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And, in that regard, I don't have any sympathy for the populist party that Cornel West joined or was working with early on, due to their willingness to put on events with libertarians and Lyndon LaRouche type people, these kind of red-brown politics that you have with Compact Magazine, for example. I don't think that's a deal that anyone should make. So, it's sort of like the problem that leftists face in various places. In some places, if you're a leftist, you can kind of anticipate that you're going to get assassinated at some point, and so why do it, right? And that's why do it. It's like Chris Hedges say, I fight fascists not because it's inevitable that I'll win, but I fight fascists because they're fascists. And this goes for macro fascists a la Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and that goes for micro fascists as well. When I go to events and I'm being sexually harassed by people and everybody's acting as if they don't see it, and there's like 5, 6, 7, 8 people doing various things that, relate to different people who have poisoned and assaulted me. And these are supposedly leftists at a Gramsci conference. It's like, what the fuck, what's going on here, right? So that's why I'm on this track critiquing microfascism. With culture wars, you can attack individuals, and if you're a category that's associated with a minority group, that seems justifiable in some ways, right? Now, of course, conservatives are going to weaponize this in a way to call it racist anti-racism or something like this. But they're using a kind of civil rights law orientation, right? Universal rights, civil rights, individual rights orientation. Foucauldians, who are all about power, they're not interested in this kind of like bourgeois rhetoric, right? It's more about what happens on the ground. It's not about what these principles are, right? So, in some ways I'm losing a lot, right? I'm losing every battle, but I'm winning the war because I'm saying that this bullshit is microfascism, right? So if you're a microfascist, and this is mostly what's going on in academia, I'm not saying I can win against this, but I can call it out. I can call it as I see it, as I understand it, and I can help other people try to understand that. I don't see what else I can do. So yeah, I was, suicidal at some point. And it wasn't because, I wasn't particularly depressed, but I was suicidal. And the reason was, people have reasons for doing things, right? Freud says that the subject hates to lie. Like, subjectivity hates to lie. But as human beings, we have a tendency to lie to ourselves, right? You have denial, and you have like rationalizations and so on, because we're social beings. And so post-structuralists want to say, well, we're not subjects at all. We're just effects of power, and we're effects of discourse. So they want to take the individual, the subject, out of the equation, going even against Freudianism, right? So you have like Deleuze's anti-Oedipus, which is rejection of psychoanalysis and Marxism, but trying to do something similar. But so anyways, my rationale was, well, this is being done to me, this public secret. I understand that this started with like, my peers, and they're competitive and they're nasty and they're petty and whatever. But then it's the staff. Then it's the instructors who know about it. Then it's not just my university that knows about it. It's the other one where I'm teaching. And then it's not just those people. It's the neighbors and the rest of the city. And then it's not just the United States. It's also Canada. And then it's not just Canada. It's also when I go to France and Cyprus and England. You know what I mean? So like, yeah, I understand. I'm not going to win that. I'm not going to win that contest, right? So, I might win the ideological battle, and so when I was, to the extent that I was suicidal, I was like, if I let this happen, I'm establishing a precedent, right? I'm letting people know that this is okay. If I kill myself, it will teach them, it will let them understand that it's not okay. But then I understood that is completely the wrong answer, right? That's not how you fight this. You have to struggle. But it's ironic because the people who are telling you you have to struggle, they're the ones who are also teaching you what's his name? Georg Lukács's narrate or describe, right? Where there's two different kinds of novelists, some who describe the world and others who narrate their struggles in the world. And so they're saying you have to fight. So the people who are saying you should narrate your struggle, they're forcing you, right, to become a national enquirer kind of character, right? They want you to understand, what women have experienced, what gays have experienced, right? So they want to see a straight white male Marxist working class, do the dance, right? Where you say, I'm a rape survivor, or I'm a something like this. And it's like completely ridiculous, right? Because you're in this simulation where you're being asked to do that tap dance, right? And if you don't do it, well, then they're just going to keep pushing, right? They're going to go the next step. So now I'm dealing with a stalker, right? Last year I was attacked twice by a stalker. He chased after me, he threw me to the ground. He accused me of doing something that I wasn't doing. And he told these other people in a wealthy neighborhood that happens to be beside the park. None of those people helped me, except one person who called 911 for me. And yesterday, before this interview, that guy was wearing checkerboard shoes. And this is like this ongoing chess game thing metaphor that they're always sticking in my face. So yesterday in front of my house, there was a pair of shoes exactly the same in front of my house. And that guy, I know that guy wants me to talk about it on this show because that's what he lives for, right? To be part of this something bigger than himself. So, that's why I talk about the difference between simulation, which is about like the reality of everything we know, and appearances, which is politics. Political Marxism is not about what we have, but about what we should have, right? About what the different kind of world that we want. And so, in my lifetime, I'm hoping this public secret will come to an end. And likewise, people who are suffering are hoping that this neoliberal agenda will come to an end, that we could at least get to something better. Who knows what it is, but Sanders was at least a step in the right direction.
100%. And having said that, let's see the Sanders campaign and these clips. Where are they from? This is from the 2020 campaign.
Well, depending on time, time is always a question. Depending on time, I have a few, but I could limit it, to one or two if you want.
Yeah, let's do about 20 more minutes because let's do 20 minutes. That way it won't push it too much. 20
I got
minutes
complaints the last time that 2.5 hours was too long. My mom.
From who? Oh, your mom.
She said it was a bit too long. So
that's always the case on this forum. I mean, we've had 4-hour shows, so
okay.
No, that's going to be the case with the long form. A lot of the people, they don't have the attention, but some of my audience, they love the long form. It's just everyone's different.
You can press pause and have dinner and then come back.
Exactly.
You don't have to watch it all at once.
Exactly. It's the same thing, right?
I used to teach at Lethbridge. I had 3 courses in one day. So I had something like an hour and a half, then I had lunch break, and then I had a 3-hour class, dinner, and then a 3-hour evening class. So, this is kind of like part of my training is to be able to talk a long time. And that's also, and that means also as a student, like being trained, like to listen for a long time, right? Because when you go to lectures, you have to focus because it's all new material, right? It's complicated and it's new material, and sitting there for 3 hours, it's a form of exercise a skill that you improve over time. So I don't notice it as much.
No, same here. Yeah. The time, it doesn't even seem like we've been talking 2 hours now, but that's how it is when you get so accustomed to doing this, in front of audiences. Initially for me, it's great practice, but then you realize maybe I'm actually good at this and people are actually learning from you. So it becomes just a habit, you don't think about the time and stuff, but right in this particular instance, I am thinking about the time. So let's definitely try to get a couple of clips in this remaining 20 minutes with Dr. Marc James Léger, based in Montreal, Canada. We're going to show some Bernie, relive some Bernie right now on the show. I know a lot of my audience is familiar with Bernie Sanders and both of the campaigns that he ran.
Okay, so I just wanted to show this because I designed the cover. So one of my hobbies is to do some artwork type stuff. And this series for Brill, it just had a generic kind of cover thing where you send them a generic photo. So I designed this cover for the book. And I also designed this one. The Bernie Bros Gone Woke is $100 from Brill, which is a kind of university library price type model of marketing. But there's a $30 version from Haymarket, this one here, which they also have a generic cover thing where they just put random maps on the covers of this series. And so I sent them a map of congressional districts, because at least that made some kind of sense in relation to the subject of the book. So this one is available paperback for $30.
Okay.
So let's go. All right. So this is the first commercial advertisement I'm showing. And Chuck Rocha has a company that works with political candidates called Solidarity Strategies. And they designed all of the marketing for the Sanders 2020 campaign. So they're the ones who did all of these commercials. And I'm showing this one first because it's the most sort of general in comparison to some of the more specific ones. So let's go with this.
Some pundits in the Democratic establishment are panicking about the possibility that he might be the Democratic nominee.
He's been the candidate who's been able to demonstrate the broadest coalition to date.
There's a lot of pain in this country that doesn't get talked about enough. And he speaks of that over and over and over again.
As you may have noticed lately, the establishment's getting a little bit nervous. Oh my God, they're putting together a multi-generational, multi-racial movement of millions of people. Oh my goodness, how can we stop that?
Senator Bernie Sanders says his campaign raked in over $46 million in February.
And that's grassroots. That's the opposite of a billionaire-backed campaign.
You need to have a multiracial coalition in the diverse, heterogeneous Democratic Party of the 21st century. Bernie Sanders is the only candidate who is checking all of those boxes.
He's got an extraordinary organization, and he's got incredible enthusiasm.
So they're getting nervous. But you know what? When we stand up together, they ain't going to stop us.
Very different from 16.
Yeah.
If you contrast that to the Vermont speech that he gave when he announced his candidacy, I believe that was in 15 when he did that particular speech. Very interesting, the contrast between what you saw there and what that's emphasis more on the racial components, the multiracial America versus the working class America.
Yeah. The first campaign, 2016, I wouldn't define it as a working class campaign, but I would define it definitely as an issues campaign. And the second, the ads designed by Chuck Rocha, one of the things he specializes in is what he refers to as cultural competence, which means that you can't pitch the same ideas, the same program to different communities in the same way. You have to, in some ways, translate the vibe, the sensibility to this different constituency. And this relates also to marketing logic, which says a few things. For one thing, Bernie didn't want to do attack ads. So he doesn't attack any other Democratic Party contestant nominee, but he does attack Trump, right? So they're not attack ads except for the fact that he attacks Trump. And his approach to attacking Trump is interesting because he's saying that we're going to unite men and women, black and white, gay and straight, against Trump, who's a racist, sexist, homophobe. And so this is this does two things at the same time. On the one hand, it marks a difference from the Republicans, but at the same time, it sort of steals the thunder from candidates like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker, who are using identity issues or identity politics to combine with their neoliberalism. So he's basically saying you can have a working class agenda, in other words, a progressive agenda. And, a working class agenda isn't just for working class people if it makes society better overall, right? So you can have a progressive agenda and at the same time, sort of like what Chuck Rocha refers to as walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Some pundits in the Democratic.
So just to preface this before I start play, the person you'll see here is Barbara Smith. It's all pretty explanatory. And this ad is a little bit longer than the previous one, but I think it's worth showing.
The struggles that shaped our present, that we take certain things for granted, like, for example, that Black people can walk into the front door of a restaurant or a hotel and ride anywhere that they wish on public transportation. That's all taken for granted now. It was a small minority of white people in the mid-20th century, that's the period we're talking about, who actually had a clue and a grasp that there's something profoundly wrong and profoundly contradictory about saying that you are the world's greatest constitutional democracy, and yet a major percentage of the people in your nation can't vote, can't live where they want to live, can't go to school, can't bend over a water fountain and get a sip of water. The reason I really trust Bernie Sanders and his candidacy is because I know he comes from a political place historically that looked at what was going on and faced what was going on with reality as opposed to hype and propaganda. It was absolutely meaningful for Bernie Sanders or for anyone else to say, no, I'm going to step away from that white skin privilege. I'm going to interrogate what is going on here around race. And then I'm going to do what most people never do. I'm going to actually put my body on the line and take a stand and work with those whose oppression we are committed to ending. That's what Bernie Sanders did. In the 1970s, I was involved with starting a Black feminist organization based in Boston, where I lived at the time. And the name of that organization is the Combahee River Collective. We did political organizing around issues of race, gender, sexuality, class, and a lot of other things as well. We did write in 1977 something that most people know us for, which is the Combahee River Collective Statement. One of the points that we made in the statement is if Black women were free, then everyone else would have to be free, because we are affected by all the systems of oppression. So if we could address and eradicate all of those systems of oppression, then everybody else would get to come along too. And we also very much believe in coalition work, even though we coined the term identity politics in the statement. What identity politics means is that we acknowledge that people have different relationships to systemic oppression based upon who they are. And that we have to take that into account when we are trying to figure out which way forward and what are we going to do to eradicate and to challenge that oppression and to make a better world. I've been out as a lesbian since the mid-1970s. The way, that movement, the lesbian and gay liberation movement was at the time, it was like, we all need to come out of the closet. We are all fighting vicious homophobia. dangerous homophobia, violent homophobia, hate crimes, and in many cases, murders. What identity politics would bring to that was that, yeah, but if you are a Black trans woman, you're in a different relationship to those issues that seemingly have been already defined. So we have to look at the specificity of who we are to figure out the solutions. We're not talking about hierarchies of oppression. Black feminism, the Black feminism that we built and that the Company River Collective built, was not about a hierarchy of oppression. It was about understanding how the oppressions fit together and not dealing with just the manifestations and the superficialities of oppression, but the roots of why things are the way they are. So that's what I think Bernie brings. He brings it to more than the table. He brings it to the nation. My name is Barbara Smith, and I'm a longtime activist in many movements since the 1960s. I'm really happy to endorse Senator Bernie Sanders.
Okay, we have to cut it in 5 minutes, but I wanted to get, I want to just respond by saying, I believe one of the biggest, one of the unfortunate things with the Sanders campaign, not even his decision to continue working with the Democrats, but simply, I believe his message was so regular and targeted to like everyday people. I believe that this culture that we lived in that is so based on the shiny new object that wants to find the shiny new object, he was almost viewed as boring. I've heard people say this. He doesn't excite me. How does changing your like everyday circumstance not excite you? But people are just, I don't know what they go in looking for. I don't know if they're looking for a show or what, but these are like real stories. Like that's a very real story. And the fact that that didn't connect the way that it should have connected, or maybe it did connect, but there were other agendas at play. I guess that's all I would say about it is that his message I thought was an authentic message. Even if I didn't agree with his strategic elements at times, I thought that his message was always a genuine message.
What? 5 minutes?
No. I had to pick my son up from school.
Oh, okay. Wow, okay. Well, that ruins my plan. All right. So, yeah, connect. You know, one of the reasons I wrote "Don't Network" was because of this idea of connectivity, right? And I sort of gave you a response to how I thought this idea, like, you know, Picasso knew this guy and that guy and that guy, and then the dog, and then, you know, it's kind of like you're trying to make sense of the world, and not through, you know, not even through narratives, through these kinds of like material forces that don't have a purchase on how a person thinks necessarily. You know, like, for example, you know, gunboat diplomacy or Russian roulette. If somebody has a gun to your head, does that make you think differently? You know, well, it might, you know, it's possible. Or maybe you've had a gun to your head before. You know, it's not the first time. Maybe you've seen this before, maybe not. So people are like trying to like, you know, figure out what comes next. But that's not really what you have in a network society. What you have in a network society is what Mark Fisher, in his book, Capitalist Realism, refers to as the pre-corporation of resistance, right? And so this is the sort of Michel Foucault model where you're working with power resistance, right? Instead of working with class struggle, you're working with the idea of relations of power. So instead of relations of production as being the basis of analysis, the basis of organization, and the basis of revolutionary change, you're working with relations of power and resistance. And basically that means it's an unending process, right? It's got no telos, it has no direction. The problem with that for a Marxist is that Marxists have this concept called totality. the totality is not simply a telos, the totality is the actually existing relations. And so the totality is basically what defines the relations of power in a capitalist society. So that what you're thinking about as connecting is actually making money for whoever it is that owns YouTube, or whoever it is that is, sending the signal. And so one of the reasons I liked Henri Lefebvre's work was very much, it was a critique of what he referred to as signals. And in a consumer society with advertising, a lot of what you're getting is this kind of like interest in quote unquote consumer behavior, right? In other words, behaviorism, which is a sort of like cybernetic feedback model. A cybernetic feedback model is a lot like a structuralist system or a I lost that train of thought, but in any case, it's a closed model. And it was basically the model that was used for the development of Cold War war game theory, the cybernetic model of feedback. And the person who wins the war is the person who can make the most friends. And so you could see how in a social universe, that's always going to break down at some point for various reasons. And so, you don't want to have your philosophy of life defined by game theory, because if you do, you're going to be chasing after Facebook friends like Selena Gomez, and then you're going to become, a subject that's adequate to neoliberalism, which is basically anarchist Marxist theory. And my critique of that, which comes through Badiou and Zizek and other sources, is that, for one thing, this kind of misunderstands what it is to be a subject, and it misunderstands politics. So that's one of the reasons I wrote that book. And so you can add that to Bernie Bros Gone Woke if you like. That would maybe help explain some of these points. But the reason I showed this commercial is because it features Barbara Smith, and she went on Democracy Now! To say that she thought, yes, Bernie Sanders is moving in a direction of identity politics. And so that was kind of like marketing Bernie Sanders in the way that on the one hand, you're producing message discipline. So it's like each of these commercials has an identity component. And at the same time, it's doing what commercials are supposed to do, which is flatter in some ways the viewer. The commercial wants to meet the viewer where they are. So this kind of looks like me approach is very effective in terms of marketing. So you don't want a commercial that says, you're voting wrong, you're not, politicizing correctly. You want something that reassures people. And so identity taps into that automatically, and especially if it's within this kind of civil rights context. So, with this Combahee River Collective, which has become in a way the holy grail of the PMC, almost like this is where politics starts, as if everything socialist before the CRC was sexist and racist and homophobic. And so finally now you have like the perfect intersectional agenda. So there's a critique of that in Class Struggle and Identity Politics, as well as in Bernie Bros Gone Woke. It's not to criticize Barbara Smith for her activism, but it's to say that basically this is a petty bourgeois PMC type politics that has very definite limits. And so this is partly Brianna Joy Gray as Bernie's press secretary bringing this into the campaign. And I thought it was a little bit, I don't think it's very informative of the issues when it comes to class and identity. I think it's more of a compromise formation that's practical, but that to me misses the mark. So I'm going to show one more commercial, let's say the last one.
Yes.
And then we'll see.
For the struggles that shaped our present.
So this is Matt McGorry, who's an actor doing an endorsement for Sanders.
I am a heterosexual white man who is committed to racial, gender, and economic justice. And for me, one of the many things that draws me to Bernie is his desire and commitment to doing that work. He was there doing the work and standing up for civil rights and for the rights of all different marginalized folks for years, for decades before I was born. Justice for some is not justice at all. I believe that Bernie understands that, and that's why I'm proud to stand behind him. And so for those of us that claim to care about racial justice, gender equity, climate justice, we have to fight. We have to put our shoulders to the wall and we have to push hard. And there's a beautiful opportunity in this. Bernie is a leader who cares about people. He's a leader who cares about the most marginalized. Bernie is a leader who fights what is right, even when it is not popular. Bernie fights for what is right before it becomes popular. I'm Matt McCory, and I am very proud to endorse Bernie Sanders for president. I am a...
Whoop. Okay. So just very quickly, so this is kind of like the equivalent, but the flip side, let's say, to identity politics as it's defined by the Combahee River Collective. Where does like intersectionality and privilege theory, where does that leave people who are in categories that are considered the privileged categories? Right. So straights, whites, males, it could be, even if you think about it as north-south, could be like north-south. And so when you think about these in economic terms, and when I say economic, I mean political economy, I don't mean libidinal economy, but of course that comes into play. You have this question of enjoyment, right? And so this person, he's not enjoying himself being a heterosexual white man. He's saying, I'm sorry, I'm a heterosexual white man. But, you know, I agree with like the solidarity of struggles. I want to support women and LGBTQ and all these things. And so it's kind of like this apologetic, you know, this kind of thing of bending the knee, you know, wearing kente cloth and bending the knee and washing the feet of people at BLM marches. This kind of like almost pseudo-religious expiation of guilt that is kind of asked by this identity politics model of politics. And so, you know, there wasn't a lot of this in the Bernie Sanders, but in a way, this is kind of what Hillary Clinton would have wanted a bit more from Bernie, and of course, excluding all of the social democratic agenda. So, you know, if there's gay liberation, or let's say within a civil rights model, because we saw an image of Harvey Milk, within a civil rights model, you're basically talking about equality for LGBTQ people, which is kind of like second wave. It isn't third wave, like it's not a postmodern model. In a third wave model, you're not asking for equality, you're asking for difference. And you're asking for equity in some cases, but really what you're talking is not about universal rights. These people have the same rights as other people. What you're talking about is, well, this way of seeing the world is actually different. You know, I have my own truth and it's an epistemological difference, and I'm being hampered by your universalism, which is basically masking a heterosexual white male European colonial position. And so that's wrong, and that has to change. And so the universalism of the civil rights, individual and group rights model gets pushed to the side. You get a kind of third wave, or even some people are talking about fourth wave, which is kind of connected to this online. The idea that somehow being online changes everything. But third and fourth wave are very similar, but in terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion sort of orientation. So I wanted to show this because it's very different from some of the other commercials, but it speaks a lot to the extent to which the Sanders campaign was going in this direction in terms of not Bernie's policies per se, but the marketing of the campaign. And I just want to mention that Jacobin magazine with the polling agency YouGov produced a study called Common Sense Solidarity, produced by the Center for Working Class Politics. And this came out after the Sanders campaign. And it's a bit, I wrote a critique of it on my blog, but it's a bit of a rejoinder to this book, in a sense, because what they're talking about is marketing in different ways in different regions. In particular, the difference in cities and in rural areas. If you go to rural areas, they recommend that you stick with the bread and butter issues, you stick with the economic issues and concerns. But in urban areas where there are a lot of university students and a lot of sort of culture vulture type people, you want to have this kind of combined identity politics plus bread and butter issues approach. And I thought that that kind of tells you a lot because, well, what does it tell you? Demographics, politics is about demographics. So you want to go with that or not? That, this is an electoral strategy. It's not a political platform. It's just a strategy for getting low information voters on board. And we saw that most of the people to which these kinds of ads are pitched, which are mostly young people, didn't actually vote. So they didn't turn out for Sanders in 2016, and they didn't turn out in large enough numbers in 2020. So I don't know how that's going to get fixed, but one can presume that in 10 and 20 years, this will be more commonplace for a candidate like Corbyn or Sanders. But what it means is that you have two politics. You've got one politics for these people, and you've got a different politics for these other people. And so what is that? That's like how to get ahead in advertising, this guy who grows two heads, right? And so it's kind of schizophrenic. So I would say that's something to be not just avoided, but that's something that the left needs to work through. Whether or not that can be, there's different parties who have these different kinds of agendas. Like, for example, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, they have kind of an agenda similar to this, but more socialist than Sanders, but with also the sort of all of the above identity struggles and also national liberation struggles. So you can get a more radical left version of this class plus identity, but I would argue it comes up to the same problems eventually. But since they're so much better on socialism, it becomes in a way less of a problem, right? Because you're obviously not in this micro-fascist type politics. However, there are, let's say, more, I don't know what you could call it, more dogmatic, more old left, I would simply say more Marxist approaches, where like Adolf Reed, for example, who's not an extreme communist, he's a democratic socialist, but he has a very good understanding and critique of this type of politics.
Dr. Léger, I hate to cut it off, but I really have to head out. But I definitely, we can definitely continue the conversation at a later time. And I know the beautiful people out there in the universe will appreciate that. But I want to say that this, we covered a lot in this episode 132. So you can view this as almost a continuation of episode 118. And I urge my audience to watch both of the episodes 118 and then watch this episode 132 with Dr. Marc James Léger, based in Montreal, Canada. And I'm going to link all of his information in the episode description. So everyone out there can share the information with their friends and family, and support independent media, support independent scholars like ourselves. We need all the support that we can get. And you're not going to get these perspectives in the mainstream a lot of times. That's why it's so important for us to support one another. With the mainstream is always going to be there, but there are also other voices that are just as important, if not more important. And so I just want to leave that idea with my audience to support independent media, support independent scholars, and definitely respect the work that's out there, because there's a lot of great work that's been done that's not always covered on the same scale and scope. But that's what I would depart with today. I wish we could talk a little bit longer, even though we have talked almost pushing 3 hours. But I'll leave the last word with Dr. Léger before we go, but we definitely have to go.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kiko. Could we do another show?
No doubt.
Oh, okay.
That's not even a question.
Okay, that's
No,
great.
we'll definitely do another show. No doubt
All right.
about it.
That would be
We'll do
cool.
another show. Yeah, we'll do it around. Let's do it right after let's do it after the election ends, just to kind of create like a reaction.
Right. So just on this Ralph Nader idea, more voices, more choices. There are other people who do the kind of work that I do. They're not very many that are working on what I call emancipatory universality, right? So it's not universality of capitalism, it's emancipatory universality. And do you mind if I rifle off a few names?
Yeah, you can give a few names, yeah.
All right. So we have, among the deceased, Ralph Miliband, Eric Hobsbawm, Ellen Meiksons Wood, and Mark Fisher, important. And among us living, Vivek Chibber, Nivedita Majumdar, Toure and Adolph Reed, Greg Meyerson, Barbara Foley, Walter Ben Michaels, David Walsh, Danielle Zamora, Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, David Harvey, Paul Street, Jody Dean, Dan Kovalik, Nancy Fraser, Cedric Johnson, Samir Gandesha, Mark Lila, who's liberal but does good work, Barbara and Karen Fields, Roger Lancaster, Terry Eagleton, Christian Parenti, Mike McNair, Cornell West, Zaiz Alua, Norman Finkelstein, Neil Larson, Paul Gilroy, Susan Neiman, Bruno Bastiles, and a few others. Zine Magubani. So these are some of the people doing this kind of work. There aren't very many of us in academia. Most people are doing intersectional, this sort of left populism or radical democracy, more postmodern type work. You're muted.
Beautiful people, we would definitely connect for our third episode with Dr. Marc James Léger again. We would definitely continue the conversation after the election, November the 5th, 2025 or 2024, 2024. I get my time mixed up so much because it's almost 2025. But regardless, enjoy your day, beautiful people, and we will talk soon. Cheers, everybody.
Dem exit.